What's up, y'all? I'm Gabe, and this is everything I watched this month, July edition. First up, I watched the Has Fallen trilogy with Olympus Has Fallen, London Has Fallen, and Angel Has Fallen. With Olympus Has Fallen, I can say that I really enjoyed this movie. It kept me enticed and had some nice emotional payoffs for what it was trying to be. I really enjoyed the fact that the fight scenes all took place in the White House and included all the little secret stashes that the White House building entails, like secret gun stashes and headset pieces. And it was sort of mimicking that Die Hard style with lots of hand-to-hand combat and rarely using guns for combat. But even when it did add those guns, it made it much more exciting considering it was all taking place in the White House. I also really enjoyed the opening scene, how after like 5 to 10 minutes of backstory, we get straight into the constant action, and those action scenes almost never die down for the rest of the movie. Unlike some other movies, instead of getting straight into it, they spend 20 minutes working on the backstory of the main character or the atmosphere of the movie, but with this movie, you just get straight into it, and I really like that about it. The only main critique I have is that when the kid was being rescued, it was a little bit too easy, and again with the secretary. I think some of those scenes could have easily been longer to add to the tension, but that doesn't lower the score all that much for me, which is why I rate it so highly. Now, while watching this movie, I had a sneaking suspicion that this first one would be like a newborn cow, and the rest of the movies would be that same cow at like age 80 after being milked his whole life, where it's the same milk out of the cow, but it's aged, so it just tastes worse. And unfortunately, I was proven correct. With London Has Fallen, the movie tries to up the ante of the prior movie, but it just embarrasses itself in doing so. The main reason for this is instead of making Gerard have to defend one president, it makes it seem that he'll have to defend multiple. But they just get killed around after having 20 seconds of screen time, so we have no time ourselves to get attached. The reason the first movie worked is because we got to know the president and his relationships, but in this movie, we don't. They just straight up get killed. Along with that, the action scenes are worse because they try and deviate from that hand-to-hand combat like the first movie. But I do have to point out one thing is that I really enjoyed this chase sequence in the middle of the movie. It was new and innovative with different techniques that I hadn't seen before. And the antagonist is just less fleshed out and less intriguing and honestly even less threatening than the first villain, which overall just lowers the score for me for this movie. Finally, onto Angel Has Fallen, and my biggest complaint with this movie is that it just feels like it forgot what happened in the first two films. In the first two films, he protects the president and his child and stops a ton of enemies of the president in his tracks. And all of a sudden, that is just forgotten and he's arrested just because there are a few pieces of evidence that point him to be that, like, bomber or whatever. It just makes no sense. Especially because you see him put all the time and effort and risk his life constantly. And he's so sad and depressed when his friends and family members of the Secret Service die, continuing to save the president, even when he was like the only one doing so. They just lose all trust immediately in him because of like 3 pieces of evidence. At least in the middle of the movie, it's understandable how they connect the dots and make Butler a POI, but in the initial lake scene, it just makes no sense. They say something like, oh, we found his DNA there, so it must be it. That's it. No other background checks. But I think this movie is worse than the second just because it focuses too much on the other aspects of this movie that we don't already care. In the worst aspects of fighting, the worst aspects of relationship building, the only thing that is the saving grace for this movie, I would say, is the relationship between Butler and his dad. That is something that was never really fleshed out in the first 2 movies, and it shows us what he missed out, why he was raised that way, why is he like that, and it's something that we don't really see all too often with these types of movies. To add on, the villain twist wasn't really a twist because it was extremely predictable who it was going to be. Next up, I watched The Blackening, and I kind of expected this movie to be a sort of a new take on the horror genre. We have these aliens, we have slashers, we have comedy, and I was expecting it to be something different, especially since the whole marketing for this movie was that all the characters are black, so there's going to make smart decisions. But I think the main problem that this movie suffers from is it's projected as a comedy horror movie, but I don't think I even laughed at all during the entire film, with the exception of a few chuckles here and there. And on top of that, the movie wasn't scary at all. The rating could have easily dropped down to PG-13 if they didn't cuss every minute. On top of that, the acting I thought was horrible for this movie. Apart from the gay character who absolutely carried the relationship and character development and chemistry between the characters, the chemistry between the other characters just felt so not fleshed out, and it didn't seem like they hung out in college at all. And the entire point of this relationship is for them to be getting back together after not seeing each other for a few years. But I know if I hung out with my friends after a few years, I wouldn't be acting like that with that animosity between them. On top of that, I'm not black, but like I said, the marketing team was just about how black people are not going to make these stupid decisions. If they hear a noise in their house, they're not going to say, "Hello, who's there?" and go looking for the noise. They're going to call the cops or get a shotgun and start shooting them. But in this movie, when put in those same scenarios, they still made those stupid decisions in the movie to the point where it just started pissing me off, which is why I rate this movie just so low. Next up, I watched Nimona, and if you guys want a more in-depth review, you can click the link in the description and check the video review I made about this movie. But just some few quick thoughts about it is, I thought this movie was fantastic. With what's been recently happening with Disney, I couldn't think they would produce something as good as they did in this current period that they're in. The voice acting for this movie is great. The atmosphere is fantastic. The chemistry between the voice actors is unbelievable. The relationship between the different characters feels super real and authentic. Especially, it's nice to have a gay relationship that isn't the whole focus of the movie. A lot of movies nowadays, they focus their entire 2-hour runtime on the fact that the characters are gay. And if you just ignore that, then it's going to act more normal and natural, and nobody's going to complain about it. Plus, also, the comedy for this movie is actually really funny. A lot of the jokes were actually embedded in the script, and they weren't just a bunch of MCU crap lines that are just trying to make 5-year-olds laugh. They actually have some depth to it. Along with the shape-shifting powers with Nimona, it gives different perspectives into stuff like fight scenes that we've already seen before. Instead of being that regular old version, those shape-shifting powers amp it up and make it a lot more interesting, which is why I rate this movie so highly. Next up, I watched The Flash, and the best way for me to describe this movie is just that it was a massive disappointment. Already within the first 10 minutes of the movie, the CGI is so bad that I literally had to stop watching and get my bearings before continuing, especially with the initial baby scene. Everything just looks so fake. And I'm sure y'all have already seen the plethora of scenes with the weird running that Ezra Miller does, along with that weird suit that just doesn't look good on screen. Now, I did like to see the different ways that the Flash attacked enemies, because it was something that didn't even appear in the Flash TV show. And I'm a big Flash and DC fan, so I was kind of just expecting the basics with the Flash TV show. But when it came to the movie, they actually put a lot more time and effort into this movie. However, the main issue that this movie suffers from is the fact that it isn't a Flash movie. It has the name, yeah, but it feels more like a Batman or Supergirl movie. If there weren't so many scenes focused on how cool the Flash looked, characters like Batman would probably have more screen time. One major drawback of this film is they try to have these emotional moments when something sad is happening to Barry, but because in the Justice League movie they made him so comedic, almost every tense and heartbreaking moment is ruined by some bad joke. And then they try so hard to please the fans by adding in characters like Michael Keaton's Batman, but I just have to ask why. Yeah, people would love to bring him back because back then he was a really good Batman. But some of the writing for him is awful, and the movie doesn't even know what to do with him because he stays the exact same. He doesn't change. He doesn't learn anything. I thought there was going to be some sort of arc with him being depressed and giving up on his Batman ways and then coming back to realize, oh, he still has that fight in him. But then when his death is reverted, they just completely take that away. Now, so much of the movie to remedy these bad problems are just cameos, like Wonder Woman, George Clooney, Nicolas Cage. But it's just pity fan service, and especially when it's horrible CGI, it doesn't even look good on the screen. But to end this review on a positive note, just because I've been ranting so badly about all the bad stuff, the fight scenes were actually pretty cool. Like I mentioned before, it felt super cool to see super speed in action and the different ways to manipulate that and fight the bad guys, especially instead of just sitting there talking like they do in the Flash TV show. Next up, I watched Oppenheimer and Barbie in that double feature, and one thing that's interesting about those two movies is that almost all the critiques and pros you can say for one movie, you can say for the other, even though they're two completely different movies. Of course, the cinematography is beautiful for both of these movies. The director, Nolan and Greta Gerwig, have both seemed to do awesome previous work, so of course, they were definitely the right fit for these two types of movies. The cast is also stacked in these movies. We got Robert Downey Jr., Cillian Murphy, Emily Blunt, Florence Pugh, all doing a fantastic job at accurately portraying Oppenheimer and his friends, family, and colleagues. Along with that, you got Margot Robbie, Ryan Gosling, Simu Liu, and Michael Cera absolutely doing fantastic jobs at portraying Barbies and Kens in this movie. And of course, Ryan Gosling, the Ken, carried this movie. Absolutely did a fantastic job at joking around and giving Barbie the time of light. And with Margot Robbie, she did a great job in pretending to be a doll, learning to be human, kind of like the Terminator series, but way more friendly. Now, of course, I also have to mention that because Oppenheimer is such a real U.S. political figure, it kind of gives Nolan free reins to do whatever he wants as long as he follows the events that happen in real time, which really lets him show his chops as a director. When he tried to make the bomb as accurate as possible, that's just something Nolan could do because he is such a good director, and stuff like that is really intriguing from this movie and made it a really fun watch. Along with that, with Barbie, I really enjoyed Will Ferrell's character and the Barbie board members. I just wish they had more screen time because they kind of just show up and disappear on and off like that. And the only other critique that I have of Nolan's Oppenheimer is just the fact that I could barely hear the dialogue in this movie because the music would be so loud at times. And I get it, it's a directorial decision. I just wish that it was a little different and he didn't do that with a lot of his movies. Next up, I watched Source Code. And Source Code is an interesting movie because it keeps you watching and entertained when it essentially is playing the same 8-minute segments of the same movie, but with slight alterations between them. However, one thing this movie does a good job at is keeping the audience members guessing as to what's going to happen next. In terms of the depth and relationship that is given for Jake Gyllenhaal's character and the other characters in this movie, it feels like some hits and some misses. For example, his relationship with Michelle Monaghan feels very authentic and real, especially in the way that Jake is in someone else's body and he has to learn about a lot of different things about that person that he took over. However, the relationship between him and Vera Farmiga feels very forced, making her decision at the end to help him out much less impactful. There could have easily been more scenes developing that relationship rather than her solely acting as his boss and guide for the events happening in the movie. The actors also failed to get me invested in their stories. Gyllenhaal, of course, is great in this role, considering I swear the only thing he plays is military in every movie, so he's already used to this. And Jeffrey Wright honestly did a great job acting as that sort of makeshift villain for the movie, but the rest of the cast felt very bland, basic, and boring. I really enjoyed, though, the overall meaning of this movie, where you want to spend all the time you have on this earth and not take things for granted because you just don't know when it will all end. They definitely did a fantastic job pushing that message to the audience. Next up, I watched Platonic, and I really enjoyed this show with how Rose Byrne and Seth Rogen play those characters. They really feel like they were destined for this type of role. They really make the relationships feel genuine, especially between each other and Rose's husband in the show. But the one bad thing I can say about this show is that the entire time while I was watching it, it kept giving me so much secondhand embarrassment because Sylvia and Will were not together. Which means the show was doing its job, yeah, but the entire time I was just like, please get together, you're clearly made for each other. But clearly the show writers wanted to save it for season 2, longer, or not even go with that plot point at all. On top of that, this show was surprisingly funny, and the dialogue was really great as well. I kind of expected it to be sort of a drama-type show, taking itself more serious, focusing on jealousy and perceptions of people around you, but as soon as I started watching, the comedy stood right out, and I'm glad it did, because the jokes are actually funny and the dialogue fits well and seems realistic, especially for someone who's clearly having that midlife crisis. Now, yes, they still tackle those difficult topics like jealousy and perceptions of people around you, but the comedy that's sprinkled in really makes the show much more digestible. The show is just one of many shows that Apple TV is putting out to try and shove themselves into the streaming wars, and if they continue to produce good quality shows like this, Silo, Severance, then Apple TV will soon rise of the ranks as clearly the best streaming service available. Next up, I watched Secret Invasion, and this TV show is just proof that Marvel has lost what made them special. This show tries to be a gritty, dark spy thriller-esque type of movie, but just reverts back to the same problems that the MCU has had for the past few years. It initially starts off doing well, but to make up for forced plot developments, bad dialogue, and bad character writing, they use the reveals of Skrulls each episode as shock value for the audience, so if they see a twist and say, oh, they got me, which means that twist was probably foreshadowed, let me look for it, forcing the audience to glance over the glaring problems that this show has. One of these problems is that Gravik is a horrible villain. His plan is so bad that his disciples fight him on his orders, so he just kills them all because he's stronger than them. Especially when it gets to the final episode and Gravik is the only one left at the compound, why send Gaia when the other heroes would do just fine against one dude? On top of that they pivot the show massively in the final episode by reverting back to a lame fight scene between Gaia and Gravik. At least if they wanted to end on the final battle, they could have easily spent more time planning it to make the battle actually incorporate all the different superheroes' DNA that was found on the battle to make the fight more interesting. Imagine how cool it would have been if they added Hulk's abilities, Thor's hammer, and a bunch of other crap rather than just having like Captain Marvel, Ant-Man, and like Korg and Groot. On top of that, inadvertently, this show ruins all character development for Rhodey from the past few years when it's found out that he's a Skrull, because he just forgot all the major important events, like even Iron Man's death. Alright, and that's everything I watched in July. If you guys are still here, I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you guys have any movies or TV show recommendations, drop them down in the comments and I'll be sure to check them out. Bye guys.